Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kailey Leinz.
I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Tyler Kendall in Washington. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio as we assess the words of Mary Daly and how they may resonate with the President of the United States, who is pushing, of course, for the Fed Chair Jerome Powell and the rest of the FOMC to lower rates. Mary Daly saying, Tyler, that she sees the economy and policy as both being in a good place and suggests that other things, like the commentary from the president, are not distracting the Fed from its core missions.
Right. She added that 2 rate cuts this year is a reasonable outlook, and at the same time, we can't wait forever on rates. Of course, probably something that the president is looking at, too. We saw him post on Truth Social earlier today after we got that retail sales data, again, calling Jerome Powell too late.
Yeah, so we're going to get reaction from a member of the House Financial Services Committee. Congressman Mike Flood is going to be with us in just a moment here on Balance of Power. But we also want to talk about how the market is interpreting Daly's words and, of course, the retail sales data that we got today. So let's begin there with Charlie Pellet looking at it from New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much. Little change in U.S. equity markets while Daly was speaking. In fact, we have got the S&P and NASDAQ both trading at records right now, something that Michael McKee was just asking about. S&P up 27.6290. That was a gain of 0.4%. NASDAQ up 166 points, up 0.8%. S&P holding close to session highs. And right now, we've got the Dow Jones Industrial Average up 129, up by 0.3%. Signs that the world's largest economy is holding up. Lifted stocks a day after speculation about the fate of Fed Chair Jay Powell rattled markets. 10-year, 4.45%. The 2-year, 3.90%. And the 30-year, 5.00%. Gold, little change, down 0.2% right now. 33.39 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude advancing 1.5%. WTI 67.38 a barrel. And Bitcoin down 0.9%, just below $119,000. So again, recapping, S&P, NASDAQ, they're both at records. S&P up 0.4%. Balance of Power continues right now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Tyler Kendall and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet in New York, we thank you so much. And you mentioned there, of course, the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, and questions about his future, which is where we want to pick up our conversation and bring in Congressman Mike Flood from Capitol Hill. He's a Republican representing Nebraska's 1st District. He's a member of the House Financial Services Committee, as well as the vice chair of the Republican Main Street Partnership. Congressman, it's good to see you, and thanks so much for joining Bloomberg TV and radio. This is where we want to start. You have an oversight role of the Fed as a member of House Financial Services. Can we just get your initial thoughts off the top here? Do you think that the administration's rhetoric, as it ramps up the pressure on Jerome Powell, could undermine the credibility of the Federal Reserve?
Well, let's start with this. I really believe in having an independent central bank. I mean, that's core to our system. The system has served us well. We are the world's financial leader. Our systems are the best. Our courts are the best. We have stability that other countries dream of, and a lot of it because of an independent central bank. But that doesn't mean that Jerome Powell is exempt from criticism. In 2008, Congress set up basically an oversight committee on monetary policy. I sit on the Monetary Policy Committee today, and there's going to be an exchange of ideas. There hasn't been a president in the last 40 years that has ever not disagreed with the chairman of the Federal Reserve. That's how this works. Now, the president reaffirmed yesterday that no, he was not going to fire Jerome Powell. He has his opportunity next spring, and the American people, by and through him, will appoint somebody. But I think, just the stock market report you got there, Americans are optimistic about where this economy is going, and you can see it in our stock market.
Well, Congressman, President Trump may have suggested yesterday it's not his intention right now to fire the chairman. He said it's highly unlikely, but he did suggest the chair still may need to go if there's evidence of fraud, something that the FHFA chair, Bill Pulte, is suggesting around the renovations of the Federal Reserve building here in Washington. He's pushing Congress for an investigation into that. Would you be supportive of such an investigation?
Well, I think there's a number of different ways that it can be investigated outside of Congress. Certainly, we won't walk away from our role in oversight. I simply don't know enough about this building project. I know that Jerome Powell is the chairman of the Federal Reserve. It's an independent central bank. It's going to remain that way. If there are these allegations and if they are substantiated, then, of course, it will be investigated in the due course. But I think we have to keep our eye on the ball. The ball is the American economy. The ball is our eye should be on the stock market. Things are going well, and if we can land these planes in Washington with the big bill, obviously, and the successive legislative priorities we have, we're going to end this year and set America up for explosive growth in 2026.
Well, Congressman, I want to pull on some of your expertise here because you do lead the subcommittee on housing. Kailey mentioned we had Bill Pulte on the show yesterday, and he's blaming Jerome Powell when it comes to mortgage rates. But we also know that the Fed can't control things like supply constraints. I'm wondering what you make of the administration's argument on this one. Is this a sustainable argument down the line when it does come to the criticism of the Fed chair?
Well, let's talk about housing in America. We are in a bad spot right now for a number of reasons. We are 5 million units short. That's what the realtors say. That's what the home builders say. So yes, we do have a supply issue. At the same time, because of weather peril and third-party litigation, we have property and casualty insurance skyrocketing. So now for a lot of homeowners, their property taxes plus their insurance premiums are more than their principal and interest. When I bought a home back in, 2004 for the first time, my interest rate was 8.5%. We've seen this before. We want it to go down. Everybody wants to have low interest rates. I get it. But to say that housing is in peril because of the interest rate, I think that's a really narrow perspective, because there are so many other issues out there, most notably supply.
Well, it's great to have your insight on that, Congressman, given your purview on that subcommittee. I want to talk about something else that falls obviously under the broader jurisdiction of financial services, where we saw the initiation of some of the crypto bills that we're expecting the House to vote on for final passage just hours from now. It's been hard fought to get to this point. I thought that roll vote yesterday might stay open forever, Congressman. The votes do seem to be there for the Genius Act, which of course was already passed by the Senate, but for the Clarity Act, even if you can get the votes today, what future do you think that realistically has in the Senate in terms of bipartisan cooperation? What are you hearing from your colleagues in the other chamber?
Well, first of all, what I hear from my constituents in Nebraska all the time is they want to see us work in a bipartisan way to deliver results for the American people and to solve problems. I bet you when the Clarity Act is presented to the House of Representatives later today, there will be at least, or maybe as many as 70 Democrats. If we can send clarity over to the House with 70 Democratic votes, plus all of the Republicans, I think that makes an excellent case for getting to 60 votes in the U.S. Senate. It sends it to President Trump's desk, and America can take its rightful spot at the very epicenter of stablecoins and digital assets and market structure. All of this has been in works for several years, but for some complications in the last couple of months, we could have even more than 70 votes in the House among Democrats. So we're on a good trajectory. I know that if you're watching the debate, you're only seeing the naysayers on the Democratic side, but trust me, there are a lot of people, and one person I encourage you to really watch her vote is former Speaker Nancy Pelosi. I'm told even she sees the value in the Clarity Act and sending that over to the Senate. So we're on a pretty good path over here. It never looks pretty. It's always made for TV when you watch the floor of the House, but it's going to get done, and we're going to have it by this weekend.
Well, Congressman, we know Wall Street is watching this debate, and stablecoins have actually made their way into the discussion on a series of recent earnings calls. We had J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup describing the upstart of the digital dollar as a potential threat to the banking industry's grip on payments and signaled that they're prepared to respond. I'm wondering what reassurances that you could give to banks that perhaps there's nothing to fear here.
Well, we worked with the American Bankers Association throughout this entire process. I was actually, as a state legislator, made Nebraska the second state in the nation to allow state chartered banks to custody digital assets. Listen, our stable coins only work, in my opinion, they only work around the world if most of them are custodied in American banks, where one stable coin equals $1 US in an FDIC insured bank. That gives me comfort that we are going to be the world's leader in stable coins. lines. We have to make sure that banks are intricately involved in this. This is the business that they've been in for hundreds of years in our country. I have a strong interest in making sure it works in sync with the banking community. And as it relates to these de novo charters and some of the things that you see people come forward with, it all requires capital. What do banks have? Banks have capital. Banks understand how this works. They're regulated. They have all sorts of different safeguards. They are very aware of know your customer and all the consumer protections. We bet big on stablecoins if banks engage and banks take the lead, and that's what I want.
Congressman, I'd like to also ask you about rescissions, as the Senate, of course, was able to pass a $9 billion, slightly shrunk rescissions package with funding cuts to PBS and NPR, as well as USAID last night. I assume you and your colleagues will be taking that up either this evening or tomorrow in the House. But Democrats are suggesting that this has complicated an effort to be bipartisan in the appropriations process as we approach the end of the fiscal year in September. As a result of passage of this rescissions package, sir, has the odds of a government shutdown increased?
Well, I don't think rescissions has anything to do with it. Look at the continuing resolution we passed in March. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, he did the right thing. He made sure the Senate funded the government. And what happened to him? In the course of a week, he lost 12 percentage points among Democratic voters in New York. AOC is talking about running against him for Senate in New York. And Chris Murphy was outwardly threatening to take him down as the Senate leader. Listen, they're in no mood to be bipartisan. They are in no mood, I'm guessing, to work on the budget. But to your point, we have to. We have no other choice.
Well,
one thing I think is
what they're saying, though, is what's the point of reaching an appropriations deal if in a partisan manner you can just rescind funding you already agreed to? You don't see that point?
Well, here's the distinction I want to make on the PBS funding. Now, I looked into this a lot because my home state has a very good public broadcasting system, both in TV and radio and digital. We are not dissolving the funding forever. We are taking the money for public television off automatic pilot 2 years into a row. We will still have to decide what funding PBS, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, gets in the budget that we craft and hopefully pass by October 1st. That is the specific impact of rescissions on the PBS funding. Now, I can't comment on all the other programs that are in there. I know some money for AIDS was put back in for HIV situations, but you know, I hear you. I know. I understand the argument. I just don't think you can tie it to just rescissions. I think this is the Democrats' base does not want to see them working with Republicans. The Democrats' base is telling their supporters to go to our town halls and get arrested, to go to our town halls and physically confront members of Congress. It's a very different, aggressive approach that I'm sure many traditional Democrats don't agree with. But their party is in no mood to see a lot done in a bipartisan manner. I am very hopeful that we can do that. I'm working with my Democratic counterpart very well on housing supply issues in my subcommittee. So I know it can happen. I just hope it does happen.
All right, Congressman, we appreciate you joining us here on Balance of Power. As always, Republican Congressman Mike Flood of Nebraska, member of the House Financial Services Committee, also vice chair of the Republican Main Street Caucus, with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. And as he mentions the Democrats, we did speak with one vocal Democrat on these issues on Balance of Power last evening. Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, the ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee, talked with us about crypto legislation and rescissions, as we just did with the congressman. Let's hear part of our conversation.
Look, I want to see us do strong crypto regulation. But what I don't want to do is see the United States government just sign off on very weak regulation that has been written by the industry. The problem with the stablecoin bill and the clarity bill in particular is that they don't do anything about the Donald Trump corruption that is occurring right out in plain view. They also don't put enough safeguards in place for consumer protection to make sure that terrorists and human traffickers and drug traffickers can't use the system, and guardrails to make sure that crypto isn't used to blow up our entire economy. So I'm very worried about that, but I want to add one more twist, and that is the Clarity bill has all those problems, but it also has a provision in it that would let any company listed on the New York Stock Exchange opt out of SEC regulation by just digitizing themselves, put themselves on the blockchain, and all of a sudden it turns out that Amazon or Meta or General Motors is no longer governed by the SEC. You do realize that literally would blow up the value of the New York Stock Exchange. That whole stock exchange has been a goose that has laid a lot of golden eggs for people in New York City, for people around the country and around the world. And this would basically just take a baseball bat to it by saying any company that doesn't want to have its books audited and make sure that it's following certain consumer protections and so on can just go somewhere else and be traded on the blockchain. There is nobody in Congress who should support that.
All right, Senator, in just the final minute that we have left with you, I want to pivot to some other news of the day, which is the rescissions package. Republicans are saying that Democrats could shut down the government over this. Is this something that the party would be willing to do instead of striking an appropriations deal with Republicans?
Look, we're just trying to ask the question of what does an appropriations deal mean? When the parties sit down, Democrats and Republicans, they work out a budget, and then after that's done, Republicans come back and say, hey, remember the price we agreed to? We just want to take your parts back. And look, where are they trying to do it? U.S. aid. There are even Republicans who are saying this makes no sense at all. We're cutting off food aid, we're cutting off aid in countries that have an epidemic of AIDS. We're cutting off the help that lets little babies be born now to mamas that are dealing with AIDS, but the baby can be born AIDS-free because of the assistance we give. And that is pennies on the dollar for the return that it gives to global health and will ultimately help keep us safer here in the United States. And the Republicans want to cut that out after we've all allocated the money and agreed to it. That's just wrong. Come on, guys.
All right, that was part of our conversation last night with Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts here on Balanced Power. She's the ranking member on the Senate Banking Committee. And Kailey really teed up that this is a busy week, actually, on Capitol Hill for Congress, particularly when we're looking at a deadline tomorrow for them to get through that rescissions package.
Yeah, we know there's nothing they work with better than a deadline. They typically like to do their best work when they're up against the clock. Also keeping in mind that the August recess is looming a few weeks from now, so they're trying to get as much done legislatively as they can before they take their long summer break. And that includes the crypto legislation that the senator made clear she's no fan of.
Right, exactly. But perhaps that could spur a little bit of a fire under them to try to get some sort of deal struck, considering they have these bills in front of them right now.
Indeed, they do. And we'll keep tracking it here on Balance of Power. And we'll have our political panel weighing in just ahead. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino will be with us on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Keeping you up to date on all things happening here in Washington, which as we speak right now at the White House is a press briefing with the White House press secretary, Karoline Leavitt. It's just begun. She's running right now through the president's upcoming travel schedule, including a trip to Scotland that is scheduled for the end of next week. But of course, we're going to be paying close attention to whether or not she sheds any light on the ongoing narrative around President Trump and his feelings or intentions with the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, which he took to True Social to talk about again today, referring to him only as too late, saying great numbers just out, referring to this morning's retail sales data, lower the rate in all caps. So still pushing for lower interest rates, even after suggesting yesterday, Tyler, that he's not planning to fire Chairman Powell, at least right now.
Right. He said it would be highly unlikely, though he did confirm that he actually floated the idea to a group of Republicans who visited him at the White House earlier this week to talk about some stalled legislation that was on the Hill. He denied that there was a letter written, which is actually something that you pressed the head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, Bill Pulte, on last night, who wouldn't confirm or deny whether or not he had written this letter in question.
Yeah, after the New York Times reported that he had drafted something, given it to the president, and maybe that's what the president was flashing around, Pulte didn't want to comment on that specifically in our interview. But of course, he did have pretty strong thoughts on the future of the Fed chairman, what the president should do, or what Chairman Powell specifically should do as he pushes for his resignation. Here's part of what he told us.
ultimately the president will make whatever decision that he sees fit. And of course, the president always follows the law, and he'll continue to do that. That will ultimately be up to the president. All I can tell you is, in charge of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, I see the devastation every day that is occurring as a result of these interest rates being kept high relative to inflation. Inflation for the last 3 months is at 1.6%. On a run rate basis. There's no basis to have these rates at 4.5%. Interest rates on mortgages have gone from 3% in President Trump's first term to 7%. It's time that Jerome Powell resign. And as I said, I hear that he's considering resigning, and I hope he does it very soon.
We should say that we did press Pulte on who he has heard that the chair is considering resigning, and he wouldn't give us further details than that. But that is where we do want to start by bringing in our political panel. They're both Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick Davis, partner at Stonecourt Capital, and Jeanne Zaino, senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick, I want to start with you, and I actually want to pull on a note from Terry Haynes of Pangea Policy, who writes that Senate opposition to the president's rhetoric is actually being led by members of the Senate Banking Committee, which, of course, has some oversight over the Fed, including Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, who has recently said that he does not believe any president has the authority to fire the Federal Reserve chair. I'm wondering, could Republicans in the Senate perhaps put up a roadblock here? Because aren't they going to have to confirm any other nominee that the president would put up to replace Jerome Powell?
Yeah, that certainly is the strength they have on the back end. Although, we've had some pretty controversial picks up to this point in time in the president's cabinet. And each time, almost 100% of the cabinet has been confirmed by the same set of senators. So the reality is it's a great threat until you actually have to implement it. I'd be surprised that if the president does wind up appointing a new Fed chairman, regardless of whether it's through a firing or retiring, that the Senate does anything other than confirm his appointee.
Well, of course, we have a long way, we think, before we get to that point, Jeanne, if we take the president at his word that he's not intending on firing Chairman Powell, at least for right now, not going to nominate someone until Powell's term is coming to an end next year. In the meantime, though, when we think about what President Trump really wants to achieve, or at least what he's signaling, he wants to make sure the interest burden is not such a burden in the United States. He doesn't want us to be having to pay so much out on our debt. He wants mortgage rates for Americans to be lower. And yet there are plenty of market participants who suggest you mess with the independence of the Federal Reserve, and actually what you might get is higher interest rates on the long end of the Treasury curve. Is there a chance here that the market actually is the one that's going to have to speak sense to President Trump?
Absolutely. And I think we've been hearing this over and over again for the last 6 months of his second term, is that so much of what he has said and done economically, it has been the market that has had to, quote unquote, talk sense into him. And so he is, like most presidents, wants the interest rates to go down. And there's nothing new about this. But you look on the one side, his tariff policy and all of this uncertainty is working against him. And Jerome Powell and most economists will tell you that. And so it may be the market in the end that has to do this. And, one big component of this entire issue is this uncertainty with his tariffs, and yet his commitment to that has outweighed everything else. And so that continues to put a strain on this issue of lowering the interest rates.
Well, to build off of this, Rick, we actually have a great story on the Bloomberg terminal today about how President Trump is struggling to market the reconciliation package, the one big, beautiful bill. There's a new CNN poll out this week that says 61% of Americans actually oppose the legislation. Now, the idea of this legislation is to stimulate the economy, get more cash into consumers' pockets quickly. I'm wondering what your take is. Why is the messaging around this bill, if we're looking at this polling, not resonating yet with Americans?
Well, I think one thing is that the administration really has not done much marketing. We talked about this the night the bill was passed in the United States Senate, that they have been spending months talking to each other about selling this bill, but they have not been spending months talking to the American people about the benefits of this bill. And they still haven't done that. In fact, the president had a wonderful opportunity in Pennsylvania to talk about it, and he talked about job creation and industry, which is his favorite topic when he hits the hustings. But he didn't address the basic framework of the tax cuts and the budget cuts. So unless somebody named Donald Trump is out talking about this bill every day, the American people are going to listen to who is, and that is Democratic senators, Democratic House members, leaders of the Democratic Party, and they have a different take on this. One of the things you can assume is one of the reasons why the president is so desperate for these tax cuts is to get the economy moving faster, to take credit for that because of the passage of the big, beautiful bill. So there are certainly good political reasons to want to see those interest rates come down, and obviously economic growth is one of them.
Well, as Rick points us to subjects that President Trump does or does not want to talk about and subjects that Democrats do or do not want to talk about, Jeanne, let's bring Jeffrey Epstein into this conversation, because this is, of course, a saga that has dominated Washington for the last week or so as conservatives or far-right members of the MAGA movement continually are pushing for more transparency around the Epstein files. And President Trump is continually saying he is not interested in talking about this any further, and actually took to Truth Social yesterday to slam some of his supporters directly, saying, quote, "Their new scam is what we will forever call the Jeffrey Epstein hoax, and my past supporters have bought into this BS hook, line, and sinker. They haven't learned their lesson and probably never will, even after being conned by the lunatic left for 8 long years." This is to his own supporters, Jeanne, or I guess what he's now referring to as his past supporters. What does it make you think?
I think we are looking at the first time in his political life that Donald Trump has not been able to control the narrative as it pertains to his own supporters. This has really gotten away from him. I described it before as sort of a Frankenstein, and that is what we are seeing. And, you know, Donald Trump usually is a very good, what I would call strategist or executioner when it comes to the media. And he's been anything but on this Epstein story. And you just said it, Kailey. You want to stop talking about something, and yet you keep going on Truth Social all weekend, day and night, long posts. You go into the Oval Office yesterday, you talk about it more. And then to make matters worse, you fire a prosecutor without apparent cause, and that would be Comey. And you do that, and that dredges it all up again. And of course, much of your supporters, from Joe Rogan to Megyn Kelly, I mean, the list goes on. Even on the SP awards last night, there was a great joke about it. This thing has its own life, and Donald Trump is not controlling it.
Well, Rick, to build off of this, we saw Congressman Ro Khanna. He's a progressive from a Democrat from California. He actually introduced a bill with an unlikely ally, though they have paired up on legislation before, which is Thomas Massie, a Republican from Kentucky, that would essentially force the House to vote on the complete release of the government's files. When you have Congress now getting involved so heavily in this, is this a story that's going to go away for this White House?
Well, this is the perfect summer scandal. I mean, we always have one in the summertime in Washington. It's one of the reasons we love Washington in the summer. Maybe the only reason we love Washington in the summer. And this is a bipartisan scandal. I mean, Jim Jordan has got Pam Bondi coming in for a August hearing in the House of Representatives. That ought to be a ton of fun. But as you point out, Democrats and Republicans are all calling for the same thing. Transparency. Let's get it all out. In fact, I think that the only person right now left in his corner to defend against both parties is Donald Trump. And for what reason? He's made good political points on, berating the deep state that's keeping this information from you. There's never been an articulation as to why there isn't a more thorough examination of these records. So, the jig is up. This is going to happen for the next 60 days. And maybe the only relief is Labor Day for the president, because then all things turn to what's happening on the Hill, and maybe he gets out of the jam then.
Well, Rick, interesting that you bring up transparency, as we are getting a bit of medical transparency right now out of the White House press briefing, as the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, shares that President Trump underwent a medical exam for swelling in his leg, that exam found chronic venous insufficiency, though Trump overall, she says, remains in excellent health. We'll, of course, continue to monitor any updates in that regard for you, Jeanne. But when we consider this issue of transparency around Jeffrey Epstein specifically, you could make the case that for President Trump, yes, it may be annoying to have to talk about it, but he's not running for re-election. He's in his last term. Less of a problem for him. What about someone like J.D. Vance, who may have greater ambitions and talked a big game about Epstein prior to being, the second hand to the president in this administration? What kind of position does this put him in?
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect example. J.D. Vance and other members of both the administration and, quite frankly, members of Congress who find themselves caught between, this huge MAGA voice, whether it's in podcasting, whether it's online, and the president himself who's saying, stop this. And so, we're going to see how J.D. Vance is able to handle it. I think the safe bet is that he should call for transparency, as you and Rick were just talking about, because that is something that almost everybody agrees is necessary in a case like this. And the problem is now with the president out there calling it a hoax, you have to ask the president, what is the hoax? Jeffrey Epstein's crimes against children, his pedophilia, what is this hoax? And he has yet to explain that. And so for J.D. Vance to have to answer these questions and other Republicans who are supporters of President Trump, it becomes very, very messy. And this doesn't go away any soon. When the problem is in your home, when it is in your base, it is very hard to run away the same way you can when it's coming from the other side.
All right, Jeanne Zaino and Rick Davis, our political panel, weighing in on this year's summer scandal. Although summer's still relatively young, we're halfway through. We might get another one. Can't rule anything out. They are, of course, with us here on Balance of Power, and we'll have more later on today, 5 p.m. Eastern Time, for the lead edition of Balance of Power. I'll be back alongside Tyler Kendall, so join us then right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.